Hello YouTube. Welcome to this episode of the Yoga Lawyer Show. I don't know why I had difficulty saying that.
First.
What did I almost say? The Lawyer Yoga Show?
Yeah.
Well, we are going to be putting the law sort of ahead of yoga today. I don't know that we'll get into yoga. We are yoga, but we don't always talk about yoga.
Yoga is us.
But we're going to be continuing sort of the conversation that we've been having over the last couple weeks about guns and mass shootings, but today we're going to look at it in more of a legal context. I know we said last week that we'd kind of look at the law. What is the state of the law with respect to guns? Because if we're going to make change, then we have to understand sort of the framework that we're working within. And interestingly, this week, there was in Florida, where we are, there was a bill passed in the Senate with some gun restrictions in Florida. It's going to be going to the House later this week. We don't know if it'll pass or not, but it raised issues that, you know, people on both sides, like sort of more conservative-leaning people, were behind some of it and against some of it, and the same on the other side, the more liberal-leaning side. So maybe that's good if both sides are a little happy and unhappy, because we've got to find common ground here. But we wanted to talk about sort of the state of law in Florida and beyond, you know, in the entire United States. What's the law and what does the Second Amendment say?
Yep, because the Supreme Court has taken cases to kind of determine if the Second Amendment is applicable today, or if the Second Amendment guarantees your right to self-defense. And Kelly knows all about the legal stuff.
Well, a little bit. You know, I'm not an expert in it, but what the current state of the law, a lot of it centers around this Heller case that I believe came out in 2008, that the U.S. Supreme Court decided while Scalia was still alive. And it basically, I have the main thrust of the holding was that the Second Amendment protects a personal right to keep and bear arms for lawful purposes. So it protects an individual, like, personal right, where we've talked about before on the show, and I know Katie's researched extensively in some of her classes at school about the history of the Second Amendment and whether it was really meant to protect this individual right to bear arms, or whether it was more about the right to bear arms in the context of a militia, which that's part of it, and the Supreme Court talks about that in the Heller decision, but they said without a doubt in that decision that the Second Amendment protects the individual right to bear arms. And what that means is that laws that infringe upon that right, state laws or federal laws that are written that infringe upon that right, will not be upheld by the Supreme Court. So
right.
There is...
So basically, regardless of the initial meaning of regardless of the initial meaning of the Second Amendment, the Supreme Court has decided that it guarantees a right to personal self-defense.
An individual's right to bear arms, and the type of arms it protects are those that are commonly used for those types of purposes. So it remains to be seen, although I have my own kind of opinion about what would happen if say in Florida, part of this bill that was passed in the Senate, there was initially an amendment that called for a ban of all assault-style weapons. And I'm not sure that would fly, that would work under the Heller decision, because the ban of any particular type of weapon, especially a weapon as common as an AR-15, it's one of the most popular, if not the most popular, sporting rifle in the country, that a ban on that would actually fly, that it would stand scrutiny from the Supreme Court.
I'm not sure a ban on any type of weapon would fly.
Probably not under Heller. You know, they kind of leave it open where if it's an unusual or highly dangerous weapon, like a sawed-off shotgun, those type of laws would work, perhaps. But to just ban categorically a weapon that's commonly used for lawful purposes, like self-defense, would probably not withhold constitutional scrutiny, and the Supreme Court would not be likely to let that law stay. Now, Scalia's gone, but we have, the new judge in there who's more Scalia-ish. Yes, Gorsuch we would like to assume he would probably come down the same way as Scalia, but what that means is the court's kind of split still on how it would work.
Yeah, so the makeup of the court hasn't really changed. Basically, if Scalia were still alive instead of Gorsuch, the same decision would probably be made.
So the Heller case would probably be upheld by the Supreme Court as good law today. So that's the framework that we're left with. And so what does that mean? There's still a lot of room to move within the Heller decision. The Heller decision itself and the cases that have followed that have suggested there's lots of ways that the states can regulate weapons, but to have an all-out ban on a particular type of weapon that's, you know, commonly used for lawful purposes is probably not going to fly. Which brings us to Florida. Like I said, that assault-style weapons ban amendment didn't make it in the bill, and if it had and it actually got voted into law, it could have ultimately been overturned. And I know there's sort of this tendency, you know, for people, myself included, that are, you know, maybe sort of have a, I don't want to say anti-gun, but come from a leaning that's not as pro-gun, to tend to want to say, let's just ban all the, you know, assault-style weapons. And that loses a lot of people, because there's a lot of common ground here between the two sides of this issue. And this, we saw this in Florida, because even though the bill isn't perfect and it may not pass, but there was sort of a coming together of both sides. And that's what we're trying to do here with the show, hopefully, is like, let's have a conversation, because there is common ground. And you know, next week, I think we're going to have someone on, a friend of the show, who is, you know, pro-gun. He is a retired law enforcement officer, member of the NRA, teaches a concealed weapons class, and, you know, very much, you know, wants to protect the individual right to bear arms, but at the same time there's common ground, because there are ways to restrict that and keep guns out of people that aren't law-abiding citizens' hands.
And one thing we found is, when having these conversations, it might be better to rephrase the argument instead of saying trigger words like gun control.
Yeah, gun control is a big one, because, you know, it sounds like control, and control is bad. And it, you know, if you're going to have a legitimate conversation with someone on another side of an issue, to use words like gun control is immediately going to be a turnoff, and you might not be able to get your point across. And the other one is to call an AR-15 an assault rifle. We hear that all the time.
Because it sounds right. AR,
it does not what it stands for.
That's not what it means.
And it isn't an assault weapon in that it isn't automatic. It's not fully automatic. You have to pull the trigger each time you shoot.
Yeah.
So that doesn't make it an assault weapon. So yeah, you know, we could get into a whole other like rabbit hole, like we like to say, about whether it's okay, you know, whether we're personally for or against these types of weapons, but it's sort of beside the point.
We have heard the argument that they are useful in certain hunting situations, which I guess, you know...
Well, yeah, it can make sense, and maybe we can ask our friend that's going to be on next week about that, too. You know, but there are legitimate reasons why you would want to be able to use that type of weapon, even for hunting. It can make sense, so... I guess the point we're trying to make here is that there's ways to kind of come together on the issue. And we like to look at statistics, because they make the most sense.
We do.
And I know, Katie, you pulled up some statistics this week. I did.
Most of them were about school resource officers, which are active law enforcement officers who have gone through active training as a law enforcement officer, and then an additional layer of training through the National Association of School Resource Officers. And they are like school cops, essentially. And there's no actual statistic of how many school cops. I couldn't find one. Kelly said that she found some statistics, but according to the National Association of School Resource Officers website, there's not a solid statistical measure of how many school resource officers there are in schools in America, because schools will share their resource officers, or multiple resource officers will be at one school, others none at another school in the same district, and it kind of depends on certain things. But I was on their website, and I thought this was interesting. I was going to note, they have an FAQ on their website, and one of the questions was whether they recommend arming teachers, which seems very relevant, because
that was part of the bill that was passed in Florida, and it's been a high topic of debate all over the country, whether arming the teachers might be part of the solution. And that's where we wanted to look at the statistics.
Right. So according to the National Association of School Resource Officers, they said, and I quote, "They strongly recommend that no firearms be on a school campus except those carried by carefully selected, specially trained school resource officers who are, by federal definition, active sworn law enforcement officers." So they're kind of against arming teachers, and it makes sense, since their whole thing is that they're training these people to be prepared for situations like school shootings. And then there's another another thing we're going to get to, but school shootings, there's a very broad definition of what counts as a school shooting. So when you hear these statistics about there being one school shooting per week, not to discount those statistics, because there might be an incident where a firearm is involved on a school campus once per week. That is an actual statistic, but you have to really do your research to understand what they're saying. That there isn't, I found some statistics that since 1990 there's been, I didn't write it down, 22 school shootings of multiple fatalities, not including the death of the perpetrator. So not including if the person who did the school shooting, the perpetrator.
Yeah. Whether that person died, but more than one person died that wasn't the perpetrator. That's the working definition of school shooting that you're using, and there have been 22 of those.
22 since 1990.
Which doesn't, when you hear that, you're like, whoa, it seems like there's been so many more. And it's not to say that it's not a problem, it's just that there are a lot bigger problems, even with gun violence in America. I mean, I think we put up some of the gun violence statistics last week, and we could certainly do that again, but gun violence is a problem. School shootings are a problem because they happen at all.
But they're an exception, not the rule. So school shootings are not as frequent as we make them out to be.
What was the statistic, though, that you had that was so interesting about, so from 1990 to...
Okay, so from 1990 to 2013, there's been 7 multiple fatality school shootings that constitute 33 deaths. I'm going to put the link and the statistics in the description bar. And then from 2013 to present day, there's been 5 multiple fatality incidents. So 7 to 5, but the 7
That doesn't add up to 22, though.
No, those are like the big mass shootings.
Okay, so there's 22 shootings at all, and then within there there's a subset where it becomes a mass shooting, which I think requires 4 or more people. Okay, so there's been 12 of those in the last 28 years, right? But then in the last 5 years...
In the last 5 years, there's been 5 that have constituted 27 deaths when compared to 33.
So that's increasing, and that's scary.
That just means that there are more mass shootings in what constitutes as
even though there's still, it's still only 5, but you would never want to even use the words only with the mass shooting, because 1 is too many.
That's what gets me, is that I get that school shootings are obviously horrific. They're terrible. But they are the exception, and there might be a bigger problem that we have to look at.
Yes, I think there is.
So maybe...
Thank you for watching the Yoga Lawyer video.